After years surrounded by machines and silence, a disgraced tycoon's life turns upside down when a mysterious girl in a wheelchair crosses his path. Thursday morning arrived at Memorial Hospital with a thick fog that seemed to foretell something different. On the 10th floor, the intensive care unit maintained its silent and predictable routine, where time stretched out in the mechanical movements of nurses and the constant hum of medical equipment. Richard Anderson had lain motionless in the presidential suite for 3 years, 8 months, and 17 days. His artificial breathing rose and fell with the cold precision of machines, while monitors traced almost imperceptible lines on the green screen. Dr. Henry Matthews, his personal physician, had visited the previous day for another routine consultation. That brought no hope. "There's nothing more we can do," he had murmured to the head nurse, Carol, a 50-year-old woman who cared for Richard as if he were family. "The family needs to make a decision." Carol adjusted the patient's blanket with her usual affection, whispering words of comfort that she knew he couldn't hear. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. At 5:45 in the morning, the corridor lights began to flicker. Carol frowned, concerned about the possibility of another generator failure. They had already experienced 3 power outages that month, and each interruption in the functioning of the equipment left her in a panic. "Marcy, can you check what's happening with the power?" she shouted to the younger nurse who was running between rooms checking the devices. It was in this moment of confusion that she appeared. A small girl, appearing no more than 10 years old, was pushing a rusty wheelchair through the hospital corridors. Her brown hair was disheveled. Her simple clothes looked like they had seen better days, but there was something in her eyes that caught attention, a depth that didn't match her apparent age. "How did this child get in here?" Carol asked aloud. But nobody answered. The security guards on the ground floor seemed not to have noticed anything, and the security cameras had stopped working at exactly that moment. The girl continued her path with impressive determination, as if she knew exactly where she was going. She passed through the wing's reception, ignored the surprised looks from the staff, and headed directly to Richard's room. "Little girl, you can't be here." Carol tried to intercept her, but for some reason her legs felt heavy, as if an invisible force was preventing her from moving quickly. The child entered the presidential room and approached Richard's bed. Her small hands extended toward the businessman's chest, and she closed her eyes as if concentrating deeply. "What are you doing?" Carol finally managed to enter the room, but something made her stop at the door. A strange, almost magical sensation filled the environment. The girl didn't answer. She just placed her palm on Richard's chest and murmured something inaudible. At that exact moment, the heart monitor that had been tracing monotonous lines for years began to sound alarms. Beep, beep, beep. The lines on the screen jumped as if an electrical discharge had run through the sleeping body. Richard's chest rose more deeply. His fingers contracted slightly, and for the first time in almost 4 years, his lips moved. "Doctor! Dr. Matthews!" Carol shouted into the intercom, running toward the bed. When she turned to look for the girl, she had disappeared. The room filled with doctors and nurses in a matter of minutes. Dr. Matthews arrived breathless, still wearing pajamas under the lab coat he had hastily put on. "This is impossible," he murmured, checking the devices and Richard's vital signs. "All functions are normalizing. How—" Richard opened his eyes slowly, like someone waking from a very deep dream. His vision was blurry, his throat dry, but he was conscious. Completely conscious. Where is she?" were his first words, pronounced with difficulty. "Mr. Anderson, you're in the hospital. Everything's fine. Stay calm," Dr. Matthews tried to reassure him, but Richard continued looking around the room desperately. The girl in the wheelchair, where is she?" Carol and the doctor exchanged confused glances. "What girl, Mr. Anderson?" But Richard couldn't explain. The memories came in fragments. A gentle presence, small hands, a comforting warmth in his chest, and a name that echoed in his mind like a persistent whisper. "Isabella." "No." "Sarah," he murmured, closing his eyes again, trying to capture the image that was fading like smoke. The next hours were a whirlwind of examinations, phone calls to the family, and attempts to understand what doctors began to call a spontaneous awakening. But for Richard, only one thing mattered: finding the girl who had brought him back to life. And as the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky orange through the hospital window, Richard knew that his true journey was just beginning. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. 3 days after the awakening, Richard Anderson vehemently ignored medical recommendations and demanded immediate discharge. Dr. Matthews tried to dissuade him, explaining the risks of leaving the hospital so soon after a prolonged coma, but Richard wasn't willing to listen. "Doctor, I spent 4 years of my life in this bed. I'm not going to waste another minute here," he declared, his voice still hoarse but filled with a determination that surprised everyone. "I need answers." His mansion in Lincoln Park was quickly adapted to receive him. Private nurses, portable, medical equipment and physical therapists were hired on permanent duty. But Richard barely paid attention to the medical care. His mind was completely focused on a single mission: finding the girl in the wheelchair. "Mr. Anderson," said Mark, his personal assistant for 15 years, "you should rest." The doctors were clear about the importance of gradual recovery. Richard was sitting in his leather armchair, surrounded by piles of papers and a laptop. His hands, still trembling slightly due to the period of inactivity, typed with difficulty. "Mark, I want you to review all the security camera footage from the hospital for the last 7 days. All of it. And I want the names of all staff who were on duty Thursday. I've already tried, sir. The cameras failed exactly during the period you mentioned. There's no record at all." Richard stopped typing and looked fixedly at Mark. There was something different in his gaze, an intensity that didn't exist before the coma, mixed with a vulnerability that his employees had never seen. "What do you mean failed, all at the same time?" "According to the technical report, there was an electrical overload that affected the entire security system for approximately 20 minutes. Coincidentally, it was the period when you awakened." Richard rose from the armchair with difficulty, supporting himself on the arms. His physical recovery was being slower than expected, but his mind functioned with disturbing clarity. "I don't believe in coincidences, Mark. I never have." In the following 2 weeks, Richard transformed into an obsessive investigator. He hired 3 different private detectives, offered absurd rewards for any information about a girl in a wheelchair seen at the hospital, and went so far as to hire a security systems specialist to analyze the camera failures. "It's technically impossible," explained the technician, a skinny man with thick glasses. "For all cameras to fail simultaneously like that, there would have to be a very specific electromagnetic interference. Or what? Or someone with very advanced knowledge of security systems planned this meticulously." Richard dismissed the technician with an impatient wave. The possibility of sabotage made no sense. Who would do this and why? It was Carol, the head nurse from the hospital, who provided the first real clue. Richard had managed to convince her to visit him at home, promising a generous donation to the hospital in exchange for her cooperation. "Mr. Anderson," said Carol, sitting uncomfortably in the luxurious living room, "I have been working in that wing for 20 years. I've never seen anything like what happened that day. Tell me everything you remember, every detail." Carol took a deep breath. The girl seemed to know the way. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask where your room was. She went straight there, and there was something in her eyes. They were the eyes of someone much older than she appeared. "Anything else?" "When she put her hand on your chest, I felt a strange sensation, as if the air in the room had become lighter, warmer. And after you awakened, I found this on the floor." Carol took from her purse a small object that made Richard's heart race. A simple bracelet made of colored beads, the kind that children often make in school activities. Richard took the bracelet with trembling hands. There was something familiar about it, but he couldn't identify what. "May I keep this?" "Of course, Mr. Anderson. Perhaps it will help in your search." That night, Richard stayed awake until dawn. turning the bracelet between his fingers. With each passing hour, his frustration grew. How could a child simply disappear without leaving traces? How could the most modern security systems fail at precisely the crucial moment? But more disturbing than the unanswered questions was the growing sensation that this girl was not a stranger. There was something about her, something in her gaze, in her presence, that echoed in deep places of his memory. Sarah, he murmured to himself, testing the name he had pronounced upon awakening. Why does this name seem so familiar? As the first ray of sunlight crossed the curtains of his mansion, Richard made a decision that would completely change the course of his investigation. He would not only search for the girl from the hospital, he would look for Sarah in his own past. Richard spent the entire night in his mansion's office, surrounded by boxes of files that Mark had brought from the company. Human resources documents, termination reports, labor lawsuits, anything that might contain some clue about a Sarah in his past life. "Sir, you should rest," insisted Helen, the night shift nurse. "It's almost 5 in the morning." "I can't. Sleep anyway," Richard replied without raising his eyes from the papers. "Bring me more coffee, please." The truth was that sleeping had become almost impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's face, felt the warmth of her small hands, heard echoes of a voice he couldn't identify, whispering his name. Mark arrived promptly at 7 in the morning, finding Richard exactly where he had left him the previous evening. Organized piles of documents covered the entire mahogany desk. "Found anything?" Richard rubbed his eyes, tired. "Mark, in 25 years of business, how many people have I fired?" "Sir? How many, Mark? You've always known all the numbers." Mark hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Mr. Anderson, you've always been direct in your business decisions. Many people have passed through the company over the years." "That doesn't answer my question." "Approximately 340 direct terminations, sir, not counting restructurings and mass layoffs." Richard was silent for a long moment. 340 people, 340 families affected by his decisions. Before the coma, these numbers were just statistics. Now each number represented a face, a story, a life altered by his word. "I need to see the most controversial cases, those that generated lawsuits, labor complaints, special situations. Sir, this could be uncomfortable." "Mark, I spent 4 years in a coma. I woke up because of a mysterious girl who knows my name and disappears without a trace. My comfort level is no longer a priority." Mark left and returned an hour later with a thinner folder, but visibly heavier due to the emotional content it carried. These are the cases that resulted in legal actions or that involved complex humanitarian situations. Richard opened the first folder. Mary Fernandez, 34 years old, administrative assistant, fired in 2019 for poor performance. Real reason, she had missed work several times to take her disabled daughter to medical appointments. The memory came like a punch to the stomach. Richard vaguely remembered the woman, how she had cried in his office begging for a chance, explaining that she was a single mother and needed the job to pay for her daughter's treatment. "She has a disabled daughter," she had said between sobs. "Please, Mr. Anderson, I just need a little flexibility in my schedule." And what had been his response? Richard closed his eyes, ashamed of the memory that emerged with painful clarity. "Personal problems cannot interfere with work, Ms. Fernandez. If you can't fulfill your obligations, there are others who can." He had fired Mary Fernandez that same week without notice, claiming just cause for job abandonment. The woman had left the office in tears, carrying a box with her personal belongings. "Mark, what happened to Mary Fernandez after the termination?" Mark consulted his notes. "She filed a labor lawsuit, sir. She lost. She didn't have resources for an experienced lawyer. After that, there are no more records. I believe she left Chicago." Richard continued reading the case. Mary Fernandez, mother of Sarah Fernandez, 8 years old with cerebral palsy. The girl had been born premature and needed constant special care. Sarah. The name echoed in his mind like distant thunder. Richard picked up the beaded bracelet he kept on the desk and examined it more carefully. There were small letters between the colored beads, S-A-R-A-H. "My God," he murmured, feeling his legs grow weak. "Sir, are you all right?" Richard didn't answer. His mind was racing, connecting dots that had previously seemed isolated. An employee cruelly dismissed. A disabled daughter named Sarah, a mysterious girl who had saved him from unconsciousness. "Mark, I need you to hire the best private investigators in Chicago. I want them to find Mary Fernandez and her daughter, Sarah, now." "Sir, may I ask why?" Richard looked out the window, observing the fine rain that was beginning to fall over the city. Something inside him had fundamentally changed. The business coldness that had always characterized him was dissolving, replaced by an emotional urgency he couldn't explain. "Because I have a debt to pay, Mark, a debt that might be impossible to repay." That afternoon, 3 different investigators received the same mission: find Mary Fernandez and her daughter Sarah. Richard offered an amount that would ensure maximum motivation in the search. But while waiting for results, one question constantly tormented him. If Sarah Fernandez was really the girl who had awakened him from the coma, how was that possible? And more importantly, what did she want from him? The answer would come sooner than he imagined, in a way that would test all the concepts of reality that Richard thought he knew. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when Richard finally decided to go to his bedroom. The investigators had worked all day without concrete results. Mary Fernandez seemed to have disappeared from Chicago shortly after the labor lawsuit, and there were no records of her current whereabouts. Richard slowly climbed the marble staircase, still adapting to the physical limitations after his coma. The physical therapist had insisted that recovery would be gradual, but his impatience grew each day. Upon opening the bedroom door, Richard stopped at the threshold. His heart raced. Sitting in the armchair by the window, illuminated only by the soft moonlight, was Sarah. This time without the wheelchair, wearing a simple, clean dress, her hair arranged in 2 braids. Her large, dark eyes stared at him with a serenity that contrasted with her apparent age. "You came," she said, her melodious voice breaking the silence. Richard remained paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. Sarah was there, real and present. "How did you get in here?" His voice came out trembling. "You called me," she answered simply, as if it were the most natural explanation in the world. Richard approached, slowly, fearing that any sudden movement would make the girl disappear again. "I called you? You've been looking for me. Your heart has been calling me." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. There were so many questions, but where to begin? "Who are you, Sarah?" The girl smiled sadly. "You know who I am." "Are you Mary Fernandez's daughter?" "I am." "How are you here? Where is your mother?" Sarah lowered her eyes, and for the first time Richard noticed a fragility in her that broke his heart. "Mum passed away 2 years ago. She got sick after losing her job. She couldn't afford the medicine." The words fell on Richard like stones. Mary Fernandez had died, and the indirect cause had been his cruel and unnecessary dismissal. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "You knew she needed the job. You knew I was sick. But you didn't care." The accusation didn't come with anger or resentment. Sarah spoke with frightening maturity, as if she were merely stating facts. Richard felt tears burning his eyes, something that hadn't happened in decades. "You're right. I was a terrible man, cruel, insensitive." "You were," she agreed, "but you aren't anymore. How can you be sure?" Sarah rose from the armchair and approached Richard. For the first time, he noticed that she didn't walk normally. Her movements were slightly uncoordinated, evidence of the cerebral palsy mentioned in the documents. "Because you're crying," she said, extending her small hand to touch Richard's face. "Cruel men don't cry for the people they've hurt." Richard held her hand between his, feeling again that comforting warmth that had awakened him from the coma. "Sarah, How did you do that in the hospital? How did you bring me back? Sometimes people need a second chance. Sometimes love is stronger than anger. Love. But you have every reason to hate me. Sarah shook her head. Mom taught me that hating hurts the one who hates more than the one who is hated. She told me that even bad people can change if they have a reason. Richard couldn't stop crying. All the hardness he had built over decades was dissolving before this extraordinary child. What do you want from me, Sarah? I want you to be the man you can be, not the man you were. How can I do that? How can I make up for all the harm I've caused? Sarah smiled, and for the first time, Richard saw genuine joy in her eyes. By helping other children like me, other families like mine, you have power, Mr. Anderson. Use it for good. Richard nodded, feeling a different determination growing in his chest. It was no longer the cold ambition of business, but something warm and urgent. I will do that. Sarah, I promise, but don't leave me again. Let me take care of you. The girl gently shook her head. I can't stay, but I'll always be watching. When you do good, when you help those in need, I'll know. Sarah, wait. But when Richard extended his hand, she was already dissolving like mist, leaving only the sweet perfume of flowers and the certainty that his life had changed forever. Alone in the room, Richard looked out the window at the sleeping city below. Millions of people, thousands of families, hundreds who might need the second chance that Sarah had given him. For the first time in his life, Richard Anderson had a purpose greater than profit, and he was not going to waste this opportunity. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what a city you're watching from. Will continue. The morning after meeting Sarah, Richard woke with an iron determination. If he wanted to honor the promise made to the girl, he needed to know the whole truth about what had happened to Mary Fernandez and her daughter. Mark, cancel all my appointments for this week, he said as soon as his assistant arrived. I need you to focus exclusively on finding information about Mary Fernandez. Sir, the investigators are already working on this. It's not enough. I want you to go personally to the neighborhoods where she lived. Talk to neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might have known her and Sarah. Mark hesitated. Mr. Anderson, may I ask why this has become so important? You've never shown interest in former employees before. Richard looked out the window, observing the city's movement. How to explain that an apparently impossible girl had completely changed his perspective on life? Because I discovered that my actions have consequences, Mark, and it's time to face them. While Mark left on his investigative mission, Richard decided to personally revisit all documents related to Mary Fernandez's dismissal. Each detail he reread embarrassed him more deeply. The labor lawsuit had been conducted by a law firm specializing in defending companies. Richard had hired the best corporate lawyers in Chicago to ensure that Mary Fernandez wouldn't receive a penny in compensation. She claimed special needs due to her daughter's medical condition, he read aloud from one of the reports. Arguments rejected, just cause confirmed for job abandonment. Richard vaguely remembered giving specific instructions. I don't want precedents. If we give in to one, all the others will want the same special treatment. Special treatment. That's how he had viewed a mother's need to care for her disabled daughter. The phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. Mr. Anderson, it's Investigator Silva. I have information about Mary Fernandez. Speak. I managed to track her history after the dismissal. The situation was complicated. Richard prepared for the worst. After losing the labor lawsuit, she spent 6 months unemployed. Her daughter Sarah needed physical therapy 3 times a week and expensive medications. Mary ended up going into debt with loan sharks to pay for the treatment. Continue. She got a job as a night cleaner, but the salary was very low. She ended up losing her apartment and moved to a slum on the east side. The conditions were precarious without proper sanitation. Richard closed his eyes, feeling nausea. In 2021, Mary contracted a severe lung infection. She had no health insurance, depended on public health care. When she finally got treatment, it was too late. Sarah was left an orphan. What happened to Sarah after that? She went to a public orphanage, but because of her disability she was constantly rejected by families interested in adoption. 2 years ago she simply disappeared from the system. Richard hung up the phone and sat in silence for several minutes. The chain of events was clear and brutal. His cruel dismissal had initiated a downward spiral that resulted in the complete destruction of that family. Mark returned late in the afternoon with even more devastating details. "I spoke with Mrs. Louise, who was Mary's neighbor in the slum," he reported. "She said Mary cried every night, blaming herself for not being able to give Sarah a better life. According to her, Mary always repeated, 'If that man had had a bit of humanity, none of this would have happened.' She was referring to me. Apparently, oh yes, Mrs. Louise also said something interesting about Sarah. What? That despite all the difficulties, the girl never showed bitterness. She always told her mother that bad people could become good, that they shouldn't give up on them." Richard felt his heart contract. Even living in poverty and suffering caused by his cruelty, Sarah had maintained hope in human kindness. "Mark, I need to do something. Call a meeting with all company employees for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Everyone from executives to cleaning staff." "May I know why?" "I'm going to ask for forgiveness." Mark's eyes widened. "Sir? I'm going to publicly admit all the mistakes I made. As a businessman, I'm going to tell Mary and Sarah's story, and I'm going to announce structural changes in the company. Mr. Anderson, this could have serious legal consequences, publicly admitting guilt." "Mark," Richard interrupted, "I spent 4 years in a coma. I woke up for a reason I can't explain scientifically. A girl who should hate me gave me a second chance. If that's not a sign to do the right thing, regardless of the consequences, then nothing is." That night, Richard spent hours preparing the most important speech of his life. It wouldn't be easy to expose his flaws in front of hundreds of employees, many of whom he had treated with the same cruelty he had shown Mary Fernandez. But it was the first real step toward the redemption that Sarah had made possible. And Richard was determined to honor the second chance he had received, whatever the cost. At 3 in the morning he looked at the beaded bracelet on his desk and murmured, "Sarah, I hope you're watching me. I promise I won't waste this opportunity." A gentle breeze swayed the curtains in his room, and Richard chose to interpret this as approval. The main auditorium of Anderson Enterprises had never received all employees at the same time. Executives in impeccable suits shared space with cleaning staff, security guards, secretaries, and operators. Curiosity and apprehension were palpable in the air. Richard arrived punctually at 2 p.m., still using a cane due to his post-coma physical limitations. Silence immediately fell when he climbed onto the stage. For years, his presence had inspired fear and tension. Today, there was something different in his posture, a vulnerability that nobody had seen before. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice echoing through the sound system. "Thank you for coming. What I'm going to say today won't be easy to hear, and it certainly isn't easy to say." Richard paused, looking at the faces in the audience. He recognized many of them, people he had humiliated, yelled at, fired without consideration. "For almost 4 years I was in a coma in the hospital. When I woke up, one question haunted me. What kind of man had I been? The answer I discovered deeply shames me." Discreet murmurs began to emerge from the audience. "I want to tell you about Mary Fernandez. She worked here as an administrative assistant for 3 years. She was a single mother of a girl named Sarah who was born with cerebral palsy and needed special care." Richard noticed that some employees shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some perhaps remembered Mary Fernandez. "Mary asked me for schedule flexibility to take Sarah to medical appointments. It was a simple, human request from a desperate mother trying to care for her daughter. My response was to fire her for just cause claiming job abandonment." The silence in the auditorium grew heavy. I didn't stop there. I hired the best lawyers to ensure she wouldn't receive any compensation. I wanted to set a precedent to show that personal problems had no place in my company. Richard saw tears in the eyes of some female employees, especially those who were mothers. Mary spent 6 months unemployed. Her daughter Sarah needed physical therapy 3 times a week and expensive medications. Mary ended up going into debt with loan sharks trying to pay for her daughter's treatment. She got a job as a night cleaner, but the salary was very low. She ended up losing her apartment and moved to a slum on the east side. The conditions were precarious without proper sanitation. Discreet sobs began to echo through the auditorium. In 2021, Mary contracted a severe lung infection. She had no health insurance, depended on public health care. When she finally got treatment, it was too late. Sarah was left an orphan. Richard paused, trying to control his emotion. "I killed Mary Fernandez," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Not physically, but my cruelty initiated a chain of events that led to the complete destruction of that family." Richard stopped trying to control his emotion. "All of you who are here have probably suffered to some degree from my coldness, my arrogance, my lack of humanity, public humiliations, arbitrary dismissals, inhumane treatment. I created a work environment based on fear and insecurity." Executives who were accustomed to the old Richard seemed shocked by the vulnerability he was demonstrating. "I can't go back in time and undo the harm I caused, but I can, from today, be a different man. Therefore, I announce the following changes which will take effect immediately." Richard took a deep breath. First, the Anderson Family Support Fund is being created, designed to help employees with children who have special health or educational needs. The fund will have an initial endowment of $50 million. Timid applause began to emerge. Second, all dismissals from the last 5 years will be reviewed. Employees who were dismissed for reasons that I now consider unjust will be invited to return with retroactive salaries paid in full. The applause grew more intense. Third, we've established flexible hours for parents who need to balance work with family care. No employee will be penalized for prioritizing family health issues. Fourth, we've created a free psychological support program for all employees and their families. Richard made a long pause, looking directly at the audience. And lastly, I ask for forgiveness from each of you, individually, for the times I treated you as numbers instead of people, for the times I ignored your human needs, for the humiliations I caused. Tears were flowing freely down Richard's face now. "I know that words are easy and actions are difficult. I promise that my behavior from now on will be the true measure of my change. I don't expect immediate forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it, but I hope for the opportunity to prove that people can change." Richard left the stage to emotional applause. Employees stood up, many crying, others embracing each other. Carla, a secretary who had been publicly humiliated by Richard 3 years earlier, approached him at the exit. "Mr. Anderson," she said with teary eyes, "thank you for apologizing. It meant a lot. Carla, I remember what I did to you. It was unforgivable, but you've changed. That matters." That night, Richard received dozens of emails from employees, some thanking him for the changes, others sharing their own stories of family difficulties, many offering a second chance. For the first time in decades, Richard felt that his life had true purpose, and as he looked out his office window at the city below, he whispered, "Sarah, I hope you saw this was just the beginning." 3 months after the speech in the auditorium, Richard was unrecognizable. The transformation wasn't just internal, his physical appearance had also changed. His grey hair was longer and more disheveled, his clothes less formal, and there was a serenity in his eyes that had replaced his former coldness. "Mr. Anderson, the architect is waiting to discuss the final details of the project," announced Mark, entering the office that now served more as a humanitarian operations center than a business room. The walls were covered with architectural plans, photographs of children with disabilities, and a painting that Richard had commissioned with the phrase, "In memory of Sarah Fernandez, who taught us that love transforms." "Send him in, Mark, and can you also bring the Family Support Fund reports?" Architect Carl Mendez entered carrying an impressive model. The Sarah Institute would occupy a 5,000 square meter plot in Lincoln Park, with complete facilities for attending to children with special needs. "As you can see, Mr. Anderson, we've included everything we discussed: physical therapy, center, occupational therapy rooms, adapted library, therapeutic pool, sensory recreation area, and apartments for families coming from other cities for treatment. Richard examined every detail of the model carefully. He wanted everything to be perfect, so that no child and no family would go through the difficulties that Sarah and Mary Fernandez had faced. And the memorial room. Here, Carl pointed to an area in the center of the building. A circular room with an internal garden where Sarah's story will be told through interactive art. It will be a space for reflection and inspiration. Perfect. When can we start construction? The permits were approved last week. We can start on Monday. After the architect left, Mark presented the numbers from the Family Support Fund, created after Richard's public speech. We've helped 47 families in the last 3 months, Mark reported. Medical treatments, surgeries, special equipment, residential renovations for accessibility. The impact has been extraordinary. Richard leafed through the reports, each case telling a story of renewed hope. Families who were giving up on treatments now had resources to continue. Children who had no access to specialized therapies were now receiving comprehensive care. Mark, there's something I need to tell you. Yes, sir? Sometimes when I'm alone here in the office, I feel as if Sarah is present. I don't see her, but I feel a warm presence, as if she's approving of what we're doing. Mark hesitated. He had known Richard for 15 years and had never heard him talk about feelings or mystical experiences. Do you think she really exists? I mean, after all we discovered about her difficult life? I don't know, Mark. And honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. Real or not, Sarah changed my life. And through this change, we're impacting other real lives. That afternoon, Richard visited one of the families benefited by the fund. Joanna Santos, no relation to Mary Fernandez, was the mother of Michael, a 7-year-old boy with Down syndrome who needed specialized therapies. Mr. Anderson, said Joanna with tears in her eyes, I don't know how to thank you. Michael is progressing so much with the therapies. Yesterday he wrote his own name for the first time. Richard knelt, to be at the boy's height, who looked at him with curiosity. Hi, Michael, I heard you're very intelligent. Michael smiled and showed a drawing he had made, a family of stick figures under a rainbow. Is this your family? Yes, Michael replied with some difficulty in speech. Dad, Mom, me and my sister. It's very beautiful. May I keep it? Michael nodded enthusiastically, and Richard carefully stored the drawing. Later in the car returning home, Richard looked at the drawing again. Something deeply touched him in the simplicity of that representation of a happy family, something he himself had never experienced or valued. Arriving home, Richard went straight to his office, where a surprise awaited him. On his desk, there was a handwritten letter. There was no stamp, no envelope, just a folded sheet of paper with childish handwriting. Dear Mr. Anderson, thank you for taking care of children like me. Thank you for being the man my mom believed you could be. Keep doing good. I will always be proud of you. With love, Sarah. Richard held the letter with trembling hands. There was no way to explain how it had gotten there. His house had rigorous security. No one had entered without authorization. But the letter was there, real and tangible, with handwriting he recognized from the school reports he had found in Mary Fernandez's records. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He walked around the house looking at old photographs, trying to understand the mysteries his life had become. In the attic, he found boxes with personal documents he hadn't seen in decades. And it was in one of those boxes that he made the discovery that would change everything. A yellowed photograph, almost forgotten, that would reveal a connection with Sarah that went far beyond what he had ever imagined. A connection that would explain everything, or perhaps make everything even more mysterious. Richard descended to the attic with a flashlight, driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. The dusty boxes contained decades of his life that he had chosen to forget, childhood documents, family photographs, seemingly worthless objects that his mother had insisted on keeping. The first box contained photo albums from the 1970s. Richard saw himself at 8, 9, 10 years old, a smiling and apparently happy boy, very different from the cruel man he had become. As he leafed through the yellowed pages, he tried to remember exactly when he had lost that innocence. It was in the third box that he found what he was looking for, even without knowing he was looking for it. A loose photograph, with edges worn by time, showed two children sitting on a park bench. A dark-haired boy, clearly Richard at 10 years old, smiled next to a slightly younger girl in a wheelchair, who looked at him with evident adoration. Richard turned the photo over. On the back, in childish but careful handwriting, was written, "Richard and Sarah, best friends forever, 1978. The world seemed to stop. Richard examined the photograph again, this time noticing details he hadn't perceived before. The girl in the wheelchair had exactly the same large, expressive eyes as the Sarah who had visited him. The same smile, the same serenity in her gaze. How was this possible? Sarah Fernandez had been born in 2011. She couldn't be in a photograph from 1978. Richard continued searching through the box, finding more photographs and some papers. There were children's drawings, birthday cards, and a folder with school documents. In a report from a second-grade teacher, he read, "Richard demonstrates great affection and protection for Sarah, a classmate with special needs. He frequently helps her during activities and refuses to play when she cannot participate. It's a very beautiful friendship to observe." The memories began to return like an avalanche. Sarah Matthews, his first true friend. She had been born with spina bifida and used a wheelchair, but to Richard as a child that had never mattered. They played together every day, created fantastic stories, shared secrets. Richard remembered now. Sarah always said that when she grew up, she would be someone's guardian angel. "I'll take care of people who need a second chance," she would say with her melodious voice. And then the most painful memory returned. Sarah had died in an accident when they were both 12 years old. Richard had been so devastated that his parents sent him to a boarding school in another city. Over time, he had blocked the memory of his friend, focusing on studies and later on business, building layers of emotional hardness that would protect him from feeling that pain again. But now, 45 years later, Sarah had returned to fulfill her childhood promise. Richard came down from the attic holding the photograph, tears streaming down his face. He sat in the living room, trying to process the revelation. The Sarah who had visited him in the hospital and in his home was his childhood friend, somehow from some place beyond human understanding. "Sarah," he murmured to the silence of the house, "you came back. After all these years, you came back to save me." A gentle breeze moved the curtains, even with the windows closed. Richard felt that familiar, warm, and reassuring presence. "You always said you would be my guardian angel," he continued, looking at the photograph. "And you were. Even when I became someone who didn't deserve protection, you didn't give up on me." Richard thought about Mary Fernandez and her daughter Sarah. Perhaps it was coincidence that she was also named Sarah, or perhaps there were no coincidences, only connections that we cannot fully understand. The important thing wasn't to understand the mystery, but to honor the gift he had received. 6 months later, the Sarah Institute was inaugurated with an emotional ceremony. Hundreds of families attended, children with disabilities played in the adapted gardens, and Richard spoke briefly about second chances and the transformative power of love. In the memorial room at the center of the Institute, the photograph of Richard as a child with his friend Sarah occupied a place of prominence alongside the following inscription. In memory of Sarah Matthews, 1968-1980, and Sarah Fernandez, 2011-2019, angels who taught us that true success is not measured in personal achievements, but in the capacity to alleviate the suffering of others. Richard visited the Institute daily. He talked with the children, helped with therapies, and every night before leaving spent a few minutes in the memorial room. "Thank you, Sarah," he always whispered, "for not giving up on me, for giving me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, for teaching me that it's never too late to change." And as the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in golden hues, Richard knew that some promises transcend time and space. His childhood friend had kept her word, truly becoming his guardian angel. Richard's life would continue, dedicated to the Institute and to families who needed support. No longer in search of forgiveness, that he had learned came from within, but in gratitude for a second chance that had transformed not only his life, but that of hundreds of other people. Because sometimes, when we lose our humanity, we need an angel to remind us of who we really are. And Sarah, all the Sarahs,